In this video, we're going to talk about classical conditioning. Classical conditioning is a type of learning in which we learn to link two or more stimuli and anticipate events. It was discovered by Pavlov. For classical conditioning, you need to know several terms. I'm going to define neutral stimulus, unconditioned response, unconditioned stimulus, conditioned response, and conditioned stimulus. And the easiest way to think about this is using an equation. So I will be using the equation that looks like this. What this says is the unconditioned stimulus leads to the unconditioned response. You pair this neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus until that neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus that leads to a conditioned response. So I'll break down these definitions and that'll help this all make sense. I'll also use the example that Pavlov had when he created classical conditioning, and that is the famous experiment with his dogs salivating to meat and then salivating to a sound. I'll just say bell for the purposes of the study. So how did he get dogs to salivate whenever they heard a bell? Using classical conditioning. So the first lines you have here, the unconditioned stimulus leading to the unconditioned response. So an unconditioned stimulus is a stimulus that naturally and automatically triggers a response. And that response is the unconditioned response. It's unlearned, natural, automatic. For the purposes of Pavlov's study, the unconditioned stimulus was meat, and the unconditioned response was salivation. So if you think about it, this unconditioned stimulus, this meat, naturally automatically triggers the salivation in the dogs. You do not have to teach a dog to salivate. If you put meat in front of him, he automatically does it. It is unlearned, it is natural. So meat is the unconditioned stimulus. The unconditioned response is salivation. Now, what happens in classical conditioning, what makes it learning instead of just normal life, is this neutral stimulus. The neutral stimulus is a stimulus that evokes no response before conditioning. It is a random, neutral thing. What you do is you present that neutral, random thing before you present the unconditioned stimulus. So for the Pavlov study, the neutral stimulus we'll use is the bell. There is no automatic response that you get from a dog when you ring a bell in front of him. It is a neutral, irrelevant, random thing. So what Pavlov would do is he would ring the bell, then he would give the dogs meat, and the meat would make the dog salivate. Now, if you do this long enough, eventually the dogs will salivate when they hear the bell, because in their minds they think, hey, I'm about to get meat, so why don't I just salivate early because the meat's about to come. If you hear the bell, you salivate because you think this step is next. Once that happens the first time, once the bell alone causes the dogs to salivate, then it is called a conditioned stimulus. So a conditioned stimulus is that originally irrelevant stimulus that, because it's associated with the unconditioned stimulus, triggers a conditioned response. So the very first time the bell alone causes the salivation, that bell is now called a conditioned stimulus. And because it is the bell that comes before the salivation and you no longer have to have the meat first, that salivation is now called a conditioned response. So a conditioned response is a learned response to a previously neutral stimulus that is now the conditioned stimulus. So whenever you have classical conditioning, you will see that the unconditioned response and the conditioned response are basically the same thing. What determines when you call it an unconditioned response and when you call it a conditioned response is what elicits it, what comes right before. As long as you still have to give the meat in order for the salivation to occur, it's called an unconditioned response because what comes right before it is an unconditioned stimulus. The first time the bell alone causes the salivation, now you call it a conditioned response because it is in response to this conditioned stimulus. So URCR, same response, but it's called something depending on what comes right before it. Same thing with the neutral stimulus and conditioned stimulus. They're still the same thing. They're both the bell in this example, but what determines when you call it a neutral stimulus and when you call it a conditioned stimulus is whether or not that thing alone will cause a response. As long as you still have to give the meat after ringing the bell, we call it a neutral stimulus. The first time you ring that bell and the salivation comes because of the bell, now you call it a conditioned stimulus. These are the parts of classical conditioning, and this is the easiest equation to remember it. And again, classical conditioning, it's learning in which you link two or more stimuli and anticipate events. It's also easy to think about it when contrasting it with operant conditioning, as classical conditioning involves more automatic behaviors like reflexes. Salivation would be an automatic thing. Operant conditioning is only voluntary behaviors.